Greetings to you all who have joined us on Zoom, on Facebook, from across the region, the continent, across the world, and of course in Zimbabwe at home. This is the sixth in a series that has attracted hundreds on Zoom and thousands on Facebook and YouTube across the globe, but in particular, the Southern African region itself, with a focus on the crisis in Zimbabwe and including a reference to its diaspora, which stands roughly at 5 million, or as I've said before, 75% of all professional and skilled Zimbabweans outside the country, in the diaspora. We're holding this session against the background of contesting or contested perceptions. On the one hand, we have a government which claims that there's no crisis. It reminds me of 2008, when a former president, a mediator, asked the same question when he arrived in, was it Addis Ababa or Cairo, was asked, is there a crisis in Zimbabwe? He says, what crisis? Here we have almost systematic, the last fortnight or more, denialism, which is normally associated or characteristic of governments under siege, regimes under siege. We are holding this in the background of the 31st of July benchmark and the rise of the Zimbabwe's Lives Matter movement, which began in the diaspora and is spread like wildfire. Interestingly, the last month or last few weeks, the events therein coincide very curiously with some of the discussions we've been having here. For example, on the 23rd of July, we had a session here on South Africa's policy towards Zimbabwe. And we asked the question then, is it a case of the tail wagging the dog, indifference, incapacity, or harvesting on a neighbor's economic woes? And of course, this was the week before 31st of July, a momentous occasion, which, as we reflected on the 6th of August, that it had less to do with what appeared, at least from the perspective of the state, as a failed demonstration, than a highlight of the crisis in Zimbabwe itself. And indeed, as we're discussing, what will it take to reach a settlement in Zimbabwe? That very evening, we received the news that President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa had decided to send 3 envoys to Harare that following weekend. And did they arrive on the 9th? They were here on the 10th and left on the 11th. And on the 9th of August, we had the AU Commission, almost in support of President Ramaphosa's initiative, declare too that they were concerned about the crisis in Zimbabwe. On the 14th of August, we had the momentous announcement by the Zimbabwe Catholic Bishops' Conference. The title of the pastoral letter, "The March is Not Ended." Momentous, I said. And this provoked a massive attack by the state to deny there was a crisis, an attack on the AU itself, unprecedented for an African state to attack the AU. On the same claim, no crisis. And in the face of the visit by the envoys, same statement, no crisis. the response to the churches was enormous, by the other churches themselves, at home and abroad, in the region, by civil society in general, in support of the bishops, by the ZCTU, by the academic intellectuals, PCC, the NGO forum, everybody laid in, highlighting that there is a crisis in Zimbabwe. So, what is the reality of the crisis, and therefore the urgent need for its resolution? Today, only today, there were at least 3, if not 4, meetings on the crisis in Zimbabwe. In Cape Town, with Rev. Topless and Zamchiya, who has just joined us, they had crisis and construction in Zimbabwe. There was Citizens Manifesto, which some of us were participating in. Again, on the crisis in Zimbabwe and the need for a comprehensive national settlement. COSATU and the ZCTU in Joburg had a meeting, crisis in Zimbabwe. And SALO, the Southern Africa Liaison Office, similarly, the crisis in Zimbabwe. Tomorrow, the ANC and Zimbabwe, Greg Mills and his colleagues, including Tendai Biti, will be hosting that. And of course, ours this evening. So, the title of our session today, Zimbabwe towards a National Transitional Authority. Presumptuous, others call it. Yes, perhaps they're correct, because we don't intend this topic to be prescriptive. The origins of it, the idea of transitional authority, broadly, historically refers to a situation which, usually following a conflict, sometimes a conflict associated with bloodshed and even war, there's need for peace talks to discuss a transition to the next stage of peace and development. For us here, goes back to 2016, when as the Platform for Concerned Citizens, we coined the term in the light of growing crisis, which crisis only a year later led to the coup in November 2017. And there were 3 major factors which made us call for a transitional authority. First, the growing incapacity of the state to reform, neither politically nor economically. Secondly, the reality of the secret state, which had become evident since 2000, in the manner in which the military had intervened in election processes and outcomes. And thirdly, the need, even then, 2016, to restore constitutionalism, a constitution which had been approved in 2013, hardly implemented, and the return of the military to the barracks, as is the case in the rest of the region. We have an accountable executive, a vibrant legislature, and a fiercely independent judiciary, all of which we must agree as absent in the Zimbabwean polity. So the NTA was proposed by some of us as a largely non-partisan group of Zimbabweans, all of whom, or rather about whom there will be agreement among all political parties and civic bodies that these are the people who can lead Zimbabwe between now and the next elections. And that the main agenda for the transitional authority would be, first of all, political reforms, such as I've referred to, return of constitutionalism, and the return of the military to the barracks. Secondly, economic reforms, in particular, a reform agenda that will restore the Zimbabwean economy to what it used to be, on the back of enormous support from the region and international community, the return of the diaspora, or a large proportion thereof, home as investors and active participants in the development program. They were also attached to it elements such as those we had in the Lancaster House Agreement, amnesty, which clearly, given the background or the backdrop of atrocities, abuse, Kukurahundi, Murambachina, the 2008 violence that killed over 300 people, the current abductions, and so on and so forth, in which the military and security sector has been highly culpable, and to see how to deal with that, as our neighbors, South Africa, did through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Also included the idea of repatriation of the billions out there, including the 15 billion for the diamonds, and how to get that home, or most of it home, while offering amnesty to those who would have taken money out of the country. So as I said earlier on, the NTA is not prescriptive, but seems simply anything similar to it that you can see us cross the Rubicon. And there are three critical questions which we will consider. Are we on the eve of a national dialogue that reflects the nature of the crisis and the need to resolve it? A national dialogue that is all-inclusive, goes beyond an elite pact, such as we've seen with the GNU in 2009. Secondly, who will play the mediation role? Can South Africa in particular play its traditional role as it has done in the past since 2007? Or someone from SADC? Or all three, South Africa, SADC, and the AU? Can they pull it off? And thirdly, can this happen before the crisis becomes a conflagration? Because there are cynics out there who say, well, we've not reached the stage where an NTA is possible. There must be more blood on the floor. We hope we don't share those kind of views. So tonight, we have a panel to assist us in unpacking and debating the way forward in Zimbabwe. Not as conclusive, not as prescriptive, but perhaps as a beginning, to begin discussing and seeing whether there is a kind of coincidence or kind of partnering between what we are doing and saying and the kind of things going on in the background. We know for a fact that the South African envoys are returning. Some of us were asked last week to make our submissions and have made our submissions. So we have Jestina Mukoko. Jestina has become a symbol of the struggle for freedom in Zimbabwe. She must be very tired. She has been on 2 panels previous to this one, and probably going to another one after this. We bring her here today, Jestina, the second time or third time, and we promise that this won't be the last time. But we bring her here as the vice chair of the National Convergence Platform, a body of civics brought together in a convergence on the 13th of December, 2019. Welcome, Jestina. Then we have Roger Southall, Emeritus Professor in Sociology at Wits. Many of you will know him from his fantastic book, Liberation Movements in Power, published in 2013, a comparative analysis of the post-liberation situation in Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. And Roger is an ardent observer and commentator on the Zimbabwean situation, only a few weeks ago, and that's the reason why we regimented him here. He wrote an interesting article on South Africa and Zimbabwe and said some comments to make, for example, that he thought, and perhaps with justification, that the idea of a national transitional authority in Zimbabwe is a pie in the sky at this rate. It will explain itself, for sure. Thirdly, and I hope Yousra Elbagir will have joined us by now. Yousra Elbagir is an award-winning journalist from the Sudan. We've seen her work on BBC and CNN, Financial Times, The Guardian. One of my colleagues described her as one of the bravest reporters, particularly for her role in the coverage of the 2019 Sudanese revolution. In fact, we're bringing Yousra here precisely for that reason, as a reference point, because only a few months ago, the Sudan concluded a national transitional authority. She can tell us more about it. And the Prime Minister there, Yousra, for your information, Hamdok worked with us at Sapes Trust in the late 90s. Yes, so we gave you a Prime Minister. Then, in Discussants, we have Musa Kika, constitutional and human rights lawyer, one of our bright sparks. He's executive director of the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum. He's trained in national dialogue and peace mediation in Switzerland. Very able, and he'll help us unpack this thing called the Transitional Authority. Then we have Phillan Zamchiya, who must be tired too, because he was busy chairing a session on crisis and construction in Zimbabwe this afternoon. A very academic outfit it was. A DPhil in international development from Oxford, as a student activist in his time, as a president of the Students' Union, an active member of the civic society at home and in the region, a public intellectual note, made his mark even though he's hardly gray like some of us. Welcome. He's based, again, one of the 75% in the diaspora. He's now in Western Cape. Welcome, Treasurer. We hope that Lindiwe Zulu, South Africa's Minister of Social Development, will join us. Lindiwe, are you anywhere nearby? Well, no sign of her. So now, I'll begin with Jestina. I'm sorry I've took a bit long, but I think we need to give some kind of background to this discussion. So I'll now invite Jestina Mukoko to give us her thoughts on the subject.
Thank you so much, Doc. And as you said in your introduction, it's been a long day in terms of talking about the crisis in our country. And today I come putting on a hat of the National Convergence Platform. And people will be also aware that the Zimbabwe Catholic Bishops' Conference also spoke about the comprehensive national settlement that the NCP concluded as a solution to the crisis that Zimbabwe is facing at the moment. And the National Convergence Platform finds its feet from the Sabbath call by Zimbabwe heads of Christian denominations. I think there was a whole lot of issues around that. And the National Convergence Platform was then birthed out of discussions around the Sabbath call. And it was then the task of the National Council to work on the comprehensive national settlement. And I will begin to look at the principles that guided this. And those principles include inclusive participation, non-partisan. And I think this is really in line with what Dr. Ibbo was talking about in terms of national dialogue that is all inclusive. And the principles also speak about local ownership. Issues need to be consensus-based, holistic solutions, and being people-centered. And then I think the NCP has called for urgent attention to the following issues. One of them being the first one, a victim-led process which follows globally accepted norms and international law, where there is dignified space to speak out about experiences of violation and loss, as well as proposals for acceptable closure. Perpetrators and alleged perpetrators may receive amnesty in return for truth-telling. And no one can dispute that we have an issue where the victim is not recognized and the voice of the victim is actually muzzled, to the extent that we have narratives where when people speak about abductions, they are told that they have abducted themselves. And that narrative muzzles the voice of the victim. And as the NCP, we are saying a process that we need is a process that is victim-led, that will make the victim the center of everything that will be done. And then number two, a broadly agreed reform process towards constitutionalism and the rule of law, where there'll be renewed trust in the electoral process and minimal contestation of election results. Political parties will not only compete for power, but also cooperate for policy integrity. And there's a recovery of the independence of the institutions of the state, security sector reform, and the whole nation redefines its unity in diversity within a devolved unitary state. And I think in all this, as we are talking about issues of trust, if we are going to look at the role of our security forces, there is very little trust that citizens have in them. And we are saying what is important is to renew citizens' trust in those institutions, because if we go to the Constitution, they actually have a big role to play in terms of ensuring that the human rights of citizens of this country are protected, and also for them to be able to protect both life and property, which are things that we feel that at the moment nothing is really happening in that regard. And I think what is very important is for people to feel the confidence to say, if something happens to you, you feel really confident to say, I will approach a police station to go and report what has happened to me, rather than being afraid that going to report will actually mean that I am also being arrested. And then number three, a new social contract on the basis of an inclusive national economic vision, where the national natural resources serve both present and future generations while preserving the environment, a formal redefinition of the relationship between the citizen and the state, and there is a nationally agreed framework regarding wealth acquired through corruption or other unaccountable means. No one can dispute the fact that Zimbabwe is well endowed as a country in terms of the resources that it has got. But at the same time, when we are looking at the situation on the ground, no one can really tell that we are a country that is really rich. And this is what we are talking about in terms of the social contract. And then number four, a broad-based and inclusive national humanitarian and emergency task force guaranteeing effective management of the COVID crisis, establishment of food security, and rehabilitation of the health, education, and other social sector institutions. I think in terms of all these sectors that I have spoken about, they are gaping deficiencies that all of us pray will be able to be resolved. And this is why the National Convergence Platform proposes that there should be a broad-based and inclusive national humanitarian and emergency task force that will guarantee that at least we will have a country that works and delivers in terms of the needs of its citizens. And then last but not least, number five, mobilization of regional, continental, and global support to end international isolation on basis of a participatory international re-engagement framework, guarantee the resolution of Zimbabwe's international debt, and underwrite the national settlement and the transitional arrangement that must follow, ensuring incentives for implementation. And I think in terms of these five, we think that as the National Convergence Platform, this could be one way of attending to Zimbabwe's crisis at the moment. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you very much, Justina. I'll leave my questions for later because I want to bring in Yousra, who wants to get away sooner than most of us because she's at work. So Roger, I'll bring you in last as a panelist. If you don't mind, I'm bringing Yousra. Yousra, welcome.
Thank you.
We would be grateful if you give us some understanding of the transitional authority in Sudan, the historical context within which it was established, and how it's doing so far.
Yeah, we are actually 1 year into the military-civilian power sharing agreement that was signed in August of last year. This came after a long period of negotiations that within that there was continued violence. So the Khartoum massacre that took place on June 3rd actually happened after Bashir was deposed, after the former president was deposed. So there was a continued power struggle and a fight for civilian rule even after Omar Bashir was ousted from power. And it was actually a march on June 30th, during an internet blackout that pushed the military junta to start actively engaging in a civilian power sharing agreement. So before that, it was sort of a back and forth, and they kept, the public, and as journalists, we would hear about hours-long meetings that really ended up with just genuinely a power struggle, from, in all meanings of the term. So June 30th really was a watershed moment, I think, for the military to see hundreds of thousands, some say millions, but hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets during an internet blackout, planning, grassroots planning for this mass protest. I would say was quite a wake-up call for the military, that even after the massacre, even after such a violent dispersal of a 2-month protest camp in front of the military headquarters, that the people weren't going to give up that easily. So a lesson in resilience, it definitely was. But after the power sharing agreement, it was definitely a process of feedback. I mean, we saw at the signing that no women were involved in the signing of the document, and that caused quite an outrage online. And so to our pleasant surprise, female ministers were actively brought in. The ratio still wasn't what was stipulated by opposition at the time, but we saw that there was definitely a feedback cycle in which those in charge were listening. But I think what you said earlier, Doctor, really rung a bell for me when you said an elite pact. And that's really what it feels like even to this day. It's a pact between, the military elite, those who have been climbing the ranks for decades, even during al-Bashir's rule, and civilian elite leaders. Our Prime Minister Hamdok was an expat for many years. He's a well-respected economist. But what a lot of people are frustrated with on the ground is the fact that the change feels very performative. So a year on, and Hamdok obviously has a very, very big task ahead of him. He says that it will take $6 billion to mend the Sudanese economy, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Zimbabwean economy was in a similar state of disrepair. It takes a lot of money to mend a hole like that, but not just a lot of money, a lot of expertise and know-how in order to really cleanse the system and the infrastructure of decades of corruption. So Hamdok has had a big task ahead of him, but we've seen recently with sit-in camps and protests erupting in Darfur and in other areas of the country, that people on the ground feel as though there has been a shift in the palace, there has been a shift in the negotiation room, but on the ground, little has changed. And I think that that is the biggest sort of post-revolution difficulty. It is grassroots change. Are people who are hardest hit by, you know, structural oppression, by economic downturn, are these people actually feeling change on the ground? And unfortunately, in the case of Sudan, they're not. You know, I think to get rid of Bashir was a big moment, and it was very empowering for protesters. But it was really only the beginning, and Bashir was a face of a much bigger, wide-reaching problem. So I think to move, you know, one thing that I've really observed is that the demands of, you know, the movement need to shift, constantly be in a state of flux, because what we have found is that every time concessions are made and every time there seems to be a move towards real progress, the momentum dies down, and the fuel for change kind of is almost sort of withdrawn, and what happens is that people get complacent, and then you see, you know, the military sort of reverting to old tricks. So I would say vigilance, I would say inclusivity, a very clear and focused target, and exactly what Justine was saying about, you know, the 4 incentives, you know, roadmap towards where you want to see Zimbabwe in the next year, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. And what we have also seen is a splintering in the opposition. So the opposition body that was planning the protests, the Sudanese Professional Association, which is a diasporic group, but also has members in country, they are completely splintered. What you see is, you know, I would say an inexperienced political opposition, an opposition that hasn't really been given space to operate within the mainstream political arena, and that has been kind of to their detriment, because, you know, the military is incredibly politically experienced, and they've held power for so long, and they are able to be malleable and negotiate and move very easily, and that is what I felt was lacking in the opposition parties, that there was a lot of infighting, that there was a lot of, you know, personal and professional ambitions at play. And that's what I think really came to be the biggest weakness in our opposition movement. But in terms of the civilian leaders who are now sharing power, they're a good group. I mean, the Justice Minister, Nasruddin, he is from Darfur. He's a lawyer trained in George Washington. And again, you know, what you said, Doctor, about diaspora returning, we are seeing diaspora returning and wanting to build the country. And there is literally a campaign saying, we will build it, Hadabnihu. So there is an incentive for change. But I think, again, grassroots change is really difficult to really to plant in a country where there is so much ethnic division. There's a lot of tribalism. You know, we recently had tribal clashes in Port Sudan. I think what our transitional authorities are finding is that the civilian side, at least, is that for the 30 years of Bashir's rule, there was an active fragmentation of the country along religious lines, along tribal lines, along political affiliation. There was genuinely a campaign to fragment and to isolate parts of the country. And it's a very difficult job to kind of mend the pieces and bring them together. But I think, again, inclusivity, resilience, vigilance, strategic planning, a very detailed roadmap towards, you know, reform, social, political, economic reform. I mean, I'm very engaged online with the Sudanese community online, and it's a very young population, and it's you know, very interesting to see even just social issues being debated in terms of colorism, in terms of sexism, in terms of sexual harassment. And these are all things that will come to the surface during you know, this flux. And it's really important to have the infrastructure in place, to have the groups in place, to be able to educate and inform these conversations. because one of the things we would say in Sudan, that this is a revolution of consciousness, and the young people would say this is a consciousness revolution. This is a shift in our attitudes as well as our country. And I think that that's something to keep in mind, that you will have a lot of young people who know nothing but the last 20, 25 years that Zimbabwe has experienced. And that it's very traumatic, and that in itself needs to be taken in consideration, especially because the political elite are a very older group of people, and in order to really keep the country in safe hands, there needs to be an active training of young people in terms of politics, economics, social advocacy work, to really feel a sustainable long-term change. Thank you.
Thank you, Yousra. Just a few questions. The first is, does the NTA in Sudan therefore reflect the balance of forces between a very strong military? I think the council is made up of 10 people, 4 military and 6 civilians. As I said at the beginning, in the Zimbabwean model, we want the military back to the barracks. Would you say that it was a shortfall in terms of the expectations of civil society, that you end up with the NTA in which the military look dominant? I mean, 4 is not a small number. One doesn't have to guess who's the power broker in such a council.
Well, as in you mean the military are the minority in the council?
No, I'm saying they're minority in numbers, but 4 are quite formidable.
And then a retired army officer as well. I think that realistically, Hamdok seems to be the face. He's a very, very great face. But in terms of who's calling the shots, it does feel like oftentimes it is Burhan, Abdel Fattah Burhan, who is the head of the Sovereign Council and who was al-Bashir's Inspector General. But at the same time, because of the fact that the military are looking for popular consensus and they are actively working on their image within the country, so they often default to the civilian face and are working with the civilian leaders in order to try and to reach at least acceptance in society, which they are really struggling with. So concessions are made from the military side, but at the same time, it is who has the guns. It always boils down to who has the power and the manpower. And we have seen that when things, with protests now, the response is a lot more docile. When I first was reporting, there were snipers on the roof. Now it's tear gas, and you will hear of a dozen or so casualties from crackdowns. But they have definitely taken a step back and are definitely trying to, allow for Sudan to enter the international fold, because they want Sudan to get off the Sudan state terrorism sponsors list, the US sanctions list. You feel like there's a very active effort to allow for the civilian leadership to take the helm. But we also, of course, can't forget that, on that Sovereign Council is Mohammed Hamdan Hemiti, who is former Janjaweed leader, and his militia that was active in Darfur during the atrocities committed during the I would say genocide, directly say genocide. He sort of rebranded his forces, RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and they've been absorbed into their paramilitary, but they've been absorbed into the Sudan Armed Forces. And that definitely, for a lot of people, it's a thorn in their hearts. How can we have progress when there's a war criminal on our Sovereign Council? So it's a tug of war. It's constantly a tug of war. And I think that the one thing that is in the favor of the people is that they are sort of very used to taking to the streets now, and they feel like they have nothing to lose.
Yousra, just one last question. So you would say, although the NTA is a compromise between the military and civil society, it's nevertheless a good start. I think it's a good start.
Yeah,
with a lot of potential.
I think it's a good start. I think it's there is the fact that there are civilian voices in the room is a very good start. And a lot of people prefer for there to be full civilian leadership. But then there's actually quite a majority of people in the country, and I can't speak on my own behalf, but a majority of the people in the country feel like the military presence is necessary to maintain stability because there are ongoing peace negotiations with the rebel groups in South Kordofan and in Darfur. So a lot of people are actually like, we're happy with this balance because we know that we are still in safe hands, which again, I think that that's active propaganda and active campaigning. And still we have this amazing technocrat diplomat as the face of our country.
Would you, in the transition, how long is it supposed to be?
It is a 3-year-long transition, and it's supposed to be split. The first half is meant to have a military head of state, which is Burhan, and the second half is meant to be a civilian military state. And we are 1 year in, and I think it's 18 months. So yeah, we have not long left, and I mean, I would say it's quite optimistic to think that there would be a peaceful handover of power from a military head to a civilian head. But I think that will be the real test as to how much this is a power sharing agreement, how much this is a balancing act, and if they would be willing to hand over power when 18 months are up, because that will be very telling.
No, thanks very much, Yousra.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It really helped us, and I think it has informed the discussion on Zimbabwe. Sudan might be quite remote in terms of distance between the two countries, but I think our guest was correct. We would learn something from the Sudan in this regard. And thanks very much for finding time to join us.
All the best in your trial.
And I'm sure we'll be in touch, won't we? Thank you, Yousra.
Thank you
very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Roger. Roger. Robert. Roger. Yep. Unmute yourself.
Yep. Are we all right?
Okay. Okay, yep. Roger. Can see you.
Okay.
Welcome, Roger. You have a lot to reflect upon, not only the expectations around Zimbabwean transition, but there you have, as a scholar of African politics, there you have the Sudan experience, which I knew something about, but I think I know more about it now.
Yeah.
So, what is your take?
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difficulties of getting the military out of politics. I think that those of us who are familiar with Zimbabwe, particularly from outside, I think a lot of the emphasis on thinking about Zimbabwe is in terms of democratization and so on, has very much been upon ZANU-PF and elections and how you run free and fair elections and so forth. And the realization that obviously the connections between ZANU-PF and the military have been, they've been wedded together really throughout the liberation struggle. And that this has continued going through from the early 1980s with the genocidal interventions. And particularly, of course, I think particularly from the election of 2008, everybody has been very, very aware of the growing influence of the military on politics and the security forces in general in Zimbabwe. Many instances of this, the statements by various military leaders that they would not accept an MDC government, they wouldn't accept Shvangirai, and so on. So I think everybody is perfectly aware of the very close ties between ZANU-PF and the military, and that goes without saying. But I think that and all that was to culminate, obviously, in the coup that wasn't a coup in 2017, and the arrival of a general, basically, in power. So I think if we want to look at something we would like to think of as a return to democracy, I think we need to think not just simply in terms of how we manage a transition, how we manage to get elections which are democratically and correctly run, but how we actually need to demilitarize politics. I think we need to put much more emphasis upon that than it's been given. Now, my chief research method at the moment, sitting at home during this crisis, is Google and Wikipedia. But a quick look through the emphasis, the literature on demilitarization tells us it's quite a complicated story. Just a little checklist here. You're talking about the reversal of the size and influence of the military. You are looking at the allocation of resources away from the military to civilian purposes. You're looking at increased civilian control over the armed forces. And you're looking at the decline in size and maybe some disarmament. And these are all very complicated processes. For a start, if there's a decline in size, you don't want to let a lot of ordinary soldiery onto the streets who are not provided for. They've got a lot of experience running around with guns, so you have to take the guns away. And you can't just dump them on the streets and leave them unemployed. So clearly, it's going to be a very, very complicated process. And we need to ask questions about who is going to do it, who is motivated to do it, who is actually going to do it. In Zimbabwean case, would ZANU-PF, let alone the military, accept it? And I think who would be the implementing agency? Because I think you've got to realize that someone's got to be in charge of this. So I just want to look very briefly at the Southern African context, because I think we've got some lessons to learn from here. If we go to the South African example, I think we have got a pretty successful process here, but I think there are always key differences with Zimbabwe. In South Africa, obviously there was a long struggle, but the liberation struggle in many ways was less militarized in South Africa. Of course, the struggle outside South Africa was huge, and there were the SADF was very active outside the country in the wars in Angola, Namibia, and so forth. But within the country, I think we need to stress, first of all, that the SADF was ultimately under civilian control, and equally, MK was under civilian control in terms of the ANC. So I think that that tradition of civilian control over the military has been very important in establishing the role of the military in South Africa's democracy since 1994. I don't know enough about demilitarization in Mozambique, but it does seem to have been that despite the civil conflicts, the extensive civil wars which happened since independence, and nonetheless that has been a successful demilitarization process with a very substantial reduction in the numbers of the size of the military. Some figures I got today were that it's down to about 8,000 or 9,000 from about 65,000. I don't know whether those figures are accurate now, but nonetheless, we don't get the same sense that Frelimo is under military influence in the way that ZANU-PF. Now, an interesting case, Lesotho. You would think that demilitarizing Lesotho would be a relatively easy task to complete compared with Zimbabwe. But nonetheless, here we have a country of about 1 million plus population, stuck in the middle of South Africa, surrounded by South Africa. But it's been in constant trouble with the military since 1970, when what was then the police mobile unit intervened on behalf of the Leah Buer-Jonathan government. And of course, there was an actual coup in 1986, and there have been various coup attempts since that. And the military has got tied up with the political parties, the The different political parties support different factions inside the military. And so it goes on. And there has been a complete failure of external attempts to withdraw the army from politics. SADC has made quite a few efforts to demilitarize politics in Lesotho, involving particularly a troika of South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. But what we find is that it continues. The SADC tends to go in, or South Africa goes in after the latest crisis, and then there is a withdrawal of military influence for a bit, and then it comes back. So the question I've got here is, if we've got such difficulty in getting the military out of civilian politics in Lesotho, I think Zimbabwe is going to be a much harder nut to crack, given the fact that we've got a much more powerful army, and we've got a much more forceful and, I think, organic connection between ZANU and the military than ever there has been in Lesotho. And apart from that, of course, as Jabasuli Shumba in particular has outlined, there is extremely close connection between ZANU military and politically linked businesses in the economy. In other words, the military is also getting quite an extensive presence inside the economy. And so that makes the whole issue of withdrawing the military even more complicated. So just to wrap up, I think, first of all, we need to put much more attention on the whole process of demilitarization as part of thinking about democratization and a transition to the NTA. I think much more is needed than the phrase which Ibbo has been using of getting the military to withdraw from the barracks. I think that is probably a minimum exercise. I think it's necessary, of course, but it implies exerting civilian control, and trying to exert civilian control is probably not going to work if ZANU-PF was going to be back in power. So you've got that process. Would you get the military to accept demilitarization? And who is actually going to undertake the process? Is there going to be some form of international involvement? For instance, would SADC have the stomach to do it? I have severe doubts. And so I think we've got a lot of questions to think about in thinking about demilitarization in Zimbabwe. That's it.
Roger, you finished there for the time being? Roger?
Yes?
Or you have finished for the time being? I wasn't sure whether you'd finished or it was a glitch on your side.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm finished.
I'm just saying one or two questions, Roger. The first is to do with the Sudan precedent. I think Yousra made the point that the military had a long history in politics and much more formidable than the Zimbabwean army in that regard, and even in terms of content. Do you see a difference? I want to say I'm waiting to hear from the Zimbabwean discussants from Zamchiya, for example. I think, first of all, the relationship between ZANU-PF and the military is a bit exaggerated. We take into account the declining of power of ZANU-PF, even in terms of content. It's not the same party that it was in 1980. Far from it. But the point I want to ask really, do you see a difference between the military being central in politics to the point where ZANU-PF has become an appendage of the military as a party, and the military being a tool of the politicians, which was the case in the 80s, where Mugabe would simply send out the military on the escapade in Gukuraundi, for example. And during that period, the army was clearly under civilian rule, to a point where the abuse of that of the military by the politicians like Mugabe led to a situation where they become it's a very central, where the state has become technocratic as it is. So do you see a difference between the military being central as it is now and the military being a tool of the politicians?
I don't know enough about Sudan, but I think that the fact that I suspect the military in Sudan is even a lot stronger than it is in Zimbabwe, as you're implying. And I think the implication of the compromise agreement in Sudan is that the military is going to go on basically having a co-equal power for quite some time. We shall see whether the transition works there. Let's hope it does. I think you're right that what we've seen in Zimbabwe is continuous flux and change with the relative influence of ZANU-PF and the military. And that I think we need to be aware of that and try and analyze that. I think you're suggesting that the influence of the military may be exaggerated. I think the problem is that you've got my guess is that the military influence is not just the people in uniform, but the connection, the fact of a lot of the people in key jobs of people who have taken their uniforms off. And so trying to disentangle the military from ZANU-PF within many state institutions actually becomes quite difficult.
Okay, I don't know really. I think I have to move to the discussants. Some of the questions that I'm asking you are really not for you. I think for Zimbabweans to answer that. And therefore, I'd like to begin with maybe Zamchiya and then come to Musa later on the constitutional and legal aspects. But maybe Zamchiya, if we can continue the discussion on the military. One of the questions I have is that the point I made earlier, do you think the role of the military is exaggerated, both in terms of numbers? By numbers, I mean that those who are the apex of the military forces, both in terms of age. They say former Zandla in terms of leadership, maybe 2 or 3, and that the army now, the army hierarchy is, interestingly, largely former ZIPRA. The top 6, the security forces are former ZIPRA, who are not ZANU. They have no relation with ZANU at all. Some would argue they're actually anti-ZANU, given the experience in the 80s where ZIPRA and ZAPU were purged. And secondly, that the people I'm talking about, the 6 or so of them, including P.V. Sibanda, may have survived the purge of ZIPRA and ZAPU in the 80s, mainly because of the relationship with Emmerson Mnangagwa, that they're all from Berengwa and might even be related, all the 6 of them. And that this leaves them rather vulnerable, or better still, amenable to have the military return to the barracks because of the very narrow social base, the vulnerability, and the growing noise of civil society. Phillan Zamchiya.
Thank you very much, Ibbo. I think that's a very fundamental question. The starting point is that the Zimbabwean military, I think at the moment, is not a homogeneous unity. It's quite differentiated along ideological lines. You talking about the ZIPRA element, the ZANLA element, There are indeed fundamental differences in terms of their ideological orientation from the liberation struggle and from the way they were trained. The Zipra element, obviously, historically, would more willing to gear towards a more professional army as compared to some of the elements within ZANLA who are more integrated in party politics. But outside that, because of the changing demographics as well, you also have a generational divide within the military in Zimbabwe. The command element of the military, your commissioned commanders, that is from the post of your lieutenant to the generals and so forth. They are the old generation, but the army has recruited. You also have the young ones who are in there. Definitely that points to a generational divide. And others participated in the liberation struggle, but some did not participate in the liberation struggle. It's also another area, a fault line. So I think it's a myth to point to the Zimbabwean army as a homogeneous unity. It is divided. Perhaps what we should look at is how the military operates. Maybe it's a commandist hierarchical order. If you have your 200 commissioned commanders there giving orders and so forth, and we know how the army operates, they're probably more powerful than the junior ranks. But is that sustainable in the current economic crisis? I don't think it is sustainable at all. I also don't think that the commissioned commanders are happy with the current economic crisis in the country. Remember, one of the reasons why they said that they had stepped in to remove Mugabe was to be able to take the nation forward in terms of economic reconstruction, in terms of transformation and so forth. But they've realized that the military cannot fix the economy, whether you have Robert Mugabe or whether you have Emmerson Mnangagwa in charge. They certainly cannot solve the hunger crisis, multiple crises that are unfolding. They cannot do that. And I'm sure by now the military, they actually know what their limits are. And we should not exaggerate their hold onto power now, because there are a lot of issues that do militate against them. I think the first thing actually is that you cannot just rule a society in modern day based on coercion, based on the bullet. You need some level of consent. You need some level of social consent from the citizens. And that is not there. So how do you sustain it? It's going to be very difficult for the military to sustain that. We have also seen the divisions within ZANU-PF. They are no longer a secret issue. It's no longer clandestine. I think it's yesterday but one, that ZANU-PF fired Chizema and two other guys from the Politburo because they are leading the debate that Emmerson Mnangagwa must retire and go back home because he has failed. These are things that you can't hear of any president, especially in the first 3 years of their term. It's unheard of. So when people talk of the National Transitional Authority, they think of it just as something that is kind of idealistic and so forth. But I would like to say there are civilians within ZANU-PF who also see that they are going nowhere and that they are going for a crash. They might not say it publicly, but behind doors, they are looking for a solution. There are military people who think that they are going nowhere. They might not say it publicly, but behind the doors, they are saying, we really need a solution out of this mess because Zimbabwe is going to crash. And once you get to a stage where you have a totally failed state, it will be very difficult to extricate them. So maybe just to conclude, what might need to be done is, number one, how do you make this idea of a national transition authority gain popular support? It needs to be mass-based and not to be seen as if it's coming from me or Tony, who are considered to be the elite sections of society. And the good thing about it is that we have a precedence. There was a constitutional movement in 1999, in 2000. When it started, it was seen as a very elite idea. But once it was taken to the masses, it became very popular that everyone in Zimbabwe now talks about the constitution and constitutionalism. But when it started, it was seen as something that was quite idealistic. So you need an all-inclusive civilian national pact on the need for a national transitional authority of some sort. And once you get that, you also need some form of regional consensus from civilian progressive unions, civil society in the region, to say this is the way to go. Then the second step now, because Zimbabwe is an advantage that there is no glaring or quite overt political vacuum at the moment, unlike what had happened in Sudan, where there was a political vacuum, and what had happened in Egypt, where there was political vacuum and the military had to step in and act as the transitional authority. Or we may talk of the revolutionary authority elsewhere. In Zimbabwe at the moment, this is the opportune time to talk about the National Transitional Authority and give it form and substance to say what is the Zimbabwe that you need to see. There can be other processes like your transition coalition, whereby you then move from the civilian national pact to a civil military pact. And Roger was talking about the possibilities that SADC is not interested. Yes, SADC might not be interested, but there are also prominent and eminent political players within SADC and on the African continent who have links with the military elites within ZIPRA and within ZANLA, like your Joachim Chissano and so forth, who can come in as a regional reference group in order to strengthen this idea. The military, the moment that they see that they are increasingly becoming isolated, both from their junior ranks and from the civilians, I think they will be able to come to the table. And as Jestina said, you need to make certain concessions in order to accelerate the democratization agenda in Zimbabwe. When ideas start, they always seem impossible. When Morgan Tsvangirai started this idea that he was going to challenge Robert Mugabe, some people thought he was being crazy until he defeated Robert Mugabe in 2008, the constitutional struggle, and nobody even ever thought that the generals were going to turn against Robert Mugabe, I mean the greater share of intellectuals, until it actually happened. And Robert Mugabe was taken out by his own former generals. So it's important for the civilian democratizing forces to be able to come up with these ideas on the table. And so far, this is the only concrete proposal that I have seen. And I hope that the political elites within the MDC are not going to play an intransigence role because they have very limited options. Either they deal with the military junta which is in place. It's not going to allow them to win elections. Even if they win elections, it's going to have a veto power to reverse the outcome of that democratic election. So it's high time that they should seriously think about this. 2002, 2008, 2013, 2018, they can't keep repeating the same mistake. I think I should stop there and just summarize that what we need to do is to allow ideas on the table. It is to debate them. The state is highly militarized, but there are vulnerabilities within the military and within the ZANU-PF political elites. Actually, they fear the military more than what opposition political leaders do. So there should be a solution in the form of a national transition authority.
Thank you very much. I think it really helps the debate by unpacking it even further and leaving us with Musa. Musa, how do you see the trajectory, if any, towards an NTA, given that we have sufficiently unpacked the forces attendant to the Zimbabwean situation, and I think Zamchiya more or less agrees with the contention that the military is exaggerated in terms of its power and influence in the Zimbabwean polity, that on the contrary, it's actually a declining force, and that many of them, including leadership, many in the leadership would welcome an NTA, if also because it might redeem them from the dilemma which faces them now, i.e. the growing crisis, economic and political. Musa?
Thanks, Ibbo, and thanks to those who came before me. I think where Zamchiya left is a good place to start. Zimbabwe is in a peculiar situation in that, unlike other countries where they've had national transitional authorities, it's because there has been a power vacuum, like in the case of Sudan, or it's because there has been conflict and violence. Currently in Zimbabwe, we are not at that stage. We do have a constitutional order that is intact, at least in form, never mind the substance. So, and that's a good thing. Jestina earlier spoke about agenda number 2 of the National Convergence Platform, being constitutionalism. So it's a good thing that we still have that fabric of constitutionalism intact, at least in form. Now, when we are to consider a national transitional authority at the moment, it's going to mean there is some level of political buy-in that is going to be needed. And this is where the legal and the political now get entangled and come together. You have the ruling party, ZANU-PF. You have the MDC and the other versions of the MDCs at the moment. For you to be able to come to that point where you say, okay, let's change the governance order now. Let's come up with an NTA. You are going to need the political forces that are in the fore to essentially agree that that is a workable solution. So there is a lot of advocacy and lobbying that is then going to go into that for the political forces to buy in. And that's important for a point that I'm going to make later on, the legal architecture of trying to put this together. You are going to need political buy-in because you're going to need political processes to lead to that. The number one thing is that having an NTA, you need it to be legal. You need that entity to be legal. You need to do it within the constitutional framework. However, there are those who would then argue that, but we do have, scheduled elections. We do have a government that was elected and confirmed by the Constitutional Court. What's the legal basis now to have an NTA? That's something that is extra legal. Now, that argument will be misplaced in many respects. Firstly, we find ourselves in an extraordinary situation, which essentially calls for extraordinary solutions. And that doesn't mean that we cannot explore solutions beyond what tabulated legalism at the moment says. An idea cannot be unconstitutional. It only becomes unconstitutional if it is implemented in a manner that is not supported by the law. But the idea itself, the whole conceptualization of an NTA in the transitional phase cannot be unconstitutional. So nothing also prevents us from imagining and reimagining our society beyond the confines of our current constitution. The constitution as we have it at the moment is a statement of intent. It's a statement of aspirations of the Zimbabwean people. But nothing stops us from confining ourselves to the four corners of that document if we are trying to imagine and reimagine what a different society would look like. Constitutions by their nature are man-made. They are meant to serve society. It's the social contract, people coming together and saying, this is how we want to be governed. And when something is seriously not working in that matrix, the people retain the power to reform in a manner or in a way that architecture. So in the Zimbabwean case, we actually do have precedents where we have done this before, albeit it was in the case of the GPA, the GNU, although the NTA proposal now is a bit different. But we had that before, and we legalized and constitutionalized that through an amendment to the Constitution, and that was Constitution of Zimbabwe Amendment number 19 in 2009. That essentially ushered the GNU period. So something similar can be done for us to usher in a national transitional authority. The processes are there, the legal processes that support that are there at the moment. So when we then speak of bringing this creature into being, essentially we are speaking about rearranging or offending in a way provisions in the Constitution around the executive, a constituted executive. We are also touching on legislative powers, the existence, the tenure of parliament. We are also touching on the right to vote, which is a right in the Bill of Rights. But the issue of the right to vote comes in when a national transitional authority is projected to cross over a scheduled election period. If it is to come within the 5-year period, we do elections in Zimbabwe at 5-year intervals. If it is to be instituted and to terminate within that period, then the right to vote is not going to be suspended at any point. So issues to do with suspension of the right to vote may not necessarily come into play. But what then comes into play is the need for us to simply constitutionalize the architecture that we will put in place to facilitate an NTA. So how exactly would we do that? And I have already given an example of how we have done it in the past, essentially amending the Constitution. What we did in 2009 was to put an addendum to the Constitution, a schedule that allowed for a suspension in the way of operation of certain provisions that were to do with the executive in the Constitution. Our Constitution doesn't have any provision that deals expressly with suspending provisions, but it has a provision on amending. And the way amend is defined in the Constitution is so broad to allow for suspension of certain clauses, even within specific periods, without necessarily doing away with those clauses permanently. So that is something that is allowed in terms of Section 328 of our Constitution. What it then means is that you are going to need political buy-in for those in Parliament to see the need to put in place this legal architecture. Essentially, you're going to need a Constitution Amendment Bill in terms of the Constitution. And if you look at how our Parliament is constituted at the moment, you have 2/3 from ZANU-PF, you have the others from the MDC and the independent one. You are going to need massive buy-in from the political players for that kind of a bill to be passed. This is why I mentioned at the beginning that this is where you find then the entanglement of the politics and the legal. So you are going to need that process. Referendum, whether we need a referendum or not, one can approach this from a technical perspective, but one can also approach it from a practical perspective. From a technical perspective, if you are going to have an NTA within the 5-year period that I have spoken about, without crossing over, a scheduled election period, you may not necessarily need a referendum because you are not suspending the right to vote at any moment. People are still going to be able to vote when the 5-year period come in. And, you know, essentially, technically, you would not necessarily need to then take it to the people in terms of the constitution, because our constitution only requires certain chapters to be taken to a referendum if you are suspending or amending them. That is chapter 4 and chapter 16. Chapter 4 being the Declaration of Rights, and chapter 16, the one to do with agricultural land. But that is as far as the technicals will go. But when you look at the political, the moral, and issues to do with national cohesion, it is advisable and wise for this kind of arrangement to be taken to a referendum. Why? Zamchiya raised the issue of this being mass-based as opposed to it being driven by the elites. The issue of trust has been raised. Trust is eroded at the moment. You are going to need a lot of trust. You are going to need buy-in of the people. And the agenda essentially is to try and craft an inclusive vision, an inclusive future for this country. That would be the whole idea behind bringing in an NTA for a particular period. So it's important for the people to have a stake in deciding whether this should happen or not. So it is advisable to take this to a referendum, even though there may be technical arguments that may support one not taking this to a referendum. You are going to need the buy-in of the people. So I think that's what I can say, Ibbo, broadly regarding the legal implications of this at the moment.
Thanks, Musa. This is excellent. This is very excellent. I'm learning a lot too, from the constitutional legal aspects of this animal called NTA. I didn't follow closely the GNU, but we'll come back to you. Now to the questions from the floor, as we say. I'll begin with Rila, but I'd like to warn those who have put up their hands already. Chris Marolang, Oswald Bina, Jana Ngube, Pearl Matibe, and Norman Nyazema. Those are the first I'll take. I'll begin with Tony Rila. Tony?
Hello and good evening. It's been entirely fascinating. My first observation is, and having listened in to the previous 5 and listened to this one, is that we are very good at identifying all the problems that will prevent us from having a solution. Now, as Phil said, I'm one of the guilty of trying to push this notion of a national transitional authority for a very long time. And the rationale was that, as Ibbo pointed out in the beginning, that some of us coming together thought that Zimbabwe was heading for a hard landing. And I doubt we could think of a harder landing than the one we've got presently. And that was based on the idea that the state and the military and the securocrat state and all the reasons that Roger Southall has pointed out were likely to be a major impediment to any kind of reform. So we tried to think of a vehicle that would move us forward. What would be a way that would change the nature of the solution for Zimbabwe? And in front of us was also the notion of the GPA that Musa has just talked about, which in the view of many of us at the particular time was a peace treaty and not any serious attempt at reform. So we've been thinking about this for an enormously long time and looked at many, many different examples. And I think that as we began these conversations, 2 sets of arguments really came to us. One was the inability to ever make this happen, that the political forces would never accept this. And we always went back to the point was that when the landing is hard enough, what happens in countries is that you go to political settlements. That's what we did in 1980. We went to a political settlement, but it wasn't a transition of a transformative kind. And we were thinking about a transformative kind. The other arguments were those that Musa has dealt with, that many lawyers said to us that any attempt to implement this will be massively unconstitutional. You will violate something that the people of the country have fought for so hard that they will be unwilling to give up. I think the answer is that you can deal with the constitutional argument without violating the Constitution. But the biggest question about this beast of the NTA is, what the heck is it? What would it look like? Who would be in charge? How would it work? And over the years, we gave many answers, all of an advisory kind. We looked at the Cadessa process in South Africa and the establishment of a transitional executive council. Could we have a transitional executive council in Zimbabwe composed of a representative group chaired by the leaders of the two major political parties? You know, a political place and a civilian place with churches and labor and civics and women and youth. How would the government run? We put forward ideas that what was necessary to have were people who would undertake the process of reform, who were competent to do that. We posed the notion of technocrats, people who knew how to run economy, people who know what's going on in health, people who know what we need for agriculture, etc., etc. And when Ibbo makes the point, and has made it repeatedly, that half our skill resides in the diaspora, we have an immensely talented population outside there where we can find the people who are able to do this technocratic job. If we try to marry these things, you're still left with a parliament until 2023. And the hope would be, and this is a big hope, I might say, in the polarized politics we have, that parliamentarians would see the value in being the midwives of a transformation, that they would do their job sitting in parliament and pass the bills and the pieces of legislation that would allow the country to move. And I think when Phil says in the state and in the party and everywhere else, there are all sorts of people who you would not think are interested in transition and transformation. I believe that in amongst the Zimbabweans are all manner of well-meaning people, even within ZANU-PF, who would see a valuable job in moving us to the next stage. So this is very visionary talk, but I also think it's immensely practical, because as we've seen in recent weeks, what we're faced with is continuous coercion by a state that is unwilling to give power, a state that is unwilling to agree that the country is in the worst crisis it's been in since independence. We see a region that is looking for a solution. And what they don't hear from Zimbabwe is what is the way forward. And I've been struck in so many of the conversations during these Sapes dialogues, where the people have said, well, we won't do anything until the Zimbabweans tell us what to do, right? Well, there's a voice. One of the voices that has come out from the churches when they said we need a comprehensive political settlement. The NCP, and they're echoing what the NCP has said, that Jestina outlined before. The issue is comprehensive national settlement to what? And the answer we would give, and we've been giving for 4 years in the Platform for Concerned Citizens, is a comprehensive national settlement towards an NTA. There is no other way. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks very much. We'll come back to that. Chris Marolang. Chris, are you there?
Yes, I am there.
Welcome,
Dr. Mandaza.
Chris. Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for allowing me an opportunity to ask this fantastic panel that you have put together a few pointed questions. And these are really around the dynamics of what a possible interlocutor, or let's call it the envoys who have been deployed to Zimbabwe. What is the advice that we would give them, given the fact that, if I follow the conversation correctly, it has been pointed out that possibly the balance of power in terms of the civil-military relations of Zimbabwe seem to indicate to us the dominance of a number of leaders within the Zimbabwe Defense Forces who have a liberation history that is more aligned, let's call it, to the ZIPRA movement, and certainly in terms of ideology tend to move towards a conventional formation and engagement of the military. Is it then, and possibly Dr. Zamchiya can assist us here, and also you, Dr. Mandaza, to say that, is it not then important for us to call upon any other grouping that would be involved in some kind of facilitated process to consider this, and also look at the points of influence, specifically regarding to what are the points of influence, in particular to the South African envoys, given the closeness of the ZIPRA formation from a historical and liberation movement perspective with Mkhonto weSizwe. Is it possible for us to give them pointed talking points and engagement points that they should be focusing on in order to move forward the process? Or, Dr. Zamchiya, would it be a situation where, by doing so, we effectively undermine the important role that the broader civil society, the citizens of Zimbabwe must play, and certainly other opposition political formations, by putting an important premium on the need to understand and unpack the levels of engagement and understanding of this group of high-level, let's call it leaders within the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Will the panelists and discussants take note of these questions? I'd like to get more questions and comments before we come back to you. Oswald, Bina? Oswald? Oswald?
Okay, thanks, Dr. Mandaza. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to just ask a question. My evaluation or analysis of our current situation, I think dates back from to the period just after independence. If you look at the culture of Zimbabwean politics, it does not respect any other national stakeholder, whether it's labor, business, or it's civil society. Politics just bulldozes every other stakeholder. And listening to the presentations, especially from Musa and Dr. Zamchiya, the general militarization of institutions in Zimbabwe has been going on for a long time in terms of state deployments into critical portfolios. And the elephant in the living room has then become the fact that maybe the military realized that the political arm of the stakeholder configuration in Zimbabwe is the most effective. To what extent is the initiative of the NTA looking at engaging deeply some political architecture that will probably drill down the awareness of the potential, good, beneficial outputs of this initiative from the ground up to this level of the academia and the well-informed? It appears as if it does not respond to that particular aspect, it will remain very elitist, and remaining elitist, it will certainly not find its way into the actual realms where it should be utilized for the greater good. That's my question.
Thanks, Oswald. Thanks very much. We'll get to Jana Ngube. Jana, unmute yourself.
Mandaza, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you too.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks. I think the point I wanted to make, perhaps it's a question as well. I liked the way we brought in Sudan as a very poignant, I think, experience for us to learn from as Zimbabwe. Although I also know that the people of Sudan learn from our own experiences and our struggles over time where we've not had the successes we've wanted to have. And also the experience of 2008, 2009 of the inclusive government. We at the moment are dealing, I think, with a machinery that is in absolute denial and does not recognize the challenges that exist for the country. So it's the description that you hear from government, from ZANU-PF, of the Zimbabwe we're experiencing is not the description that Jestina made today. So 2008, 2009 happened because there was an acknowledgement from ZANU-PF and government that there was a crisis in the country. Sudan was a different situation where you had the leaders in absolute denial, and the people took, I think, a certain type of action that compelled the kind of negotiations that led to the changes that we saw. I think the big question for us in Zimbabwe 20 plus years later is dealing with a regime that is in absolute denial, that is describing a different experience of Zimbabwe. What do the panelists advise? What thoughts do we proffer for ourselves in terms of a way forward that should, in a way for me, compel and force folks to the table to actually be willing to accept that there's something going on wrong. Musa well pointed out that no matter what you do, at the end of the day, you will need some political engagement because it's political processes that will create legal frameworks for us at the end of the day as a people. So that's a thought. It's a question that is being expressed as a thought. Thank you.
Jana, before you go, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You are still on the Presidential Advisory Committee?
You have a question for me?
Yes.
Yes.
Along the lines of your own question, do you think, as advisor that you are on the PAC, the Presidential Advisory Committee, do you think that the political leadership in Zimbabwe, including the current head of state, are amenable to such discussions as that which we are discussing right now, the NTA?
I think the answer is obvious, Dr. Mandaza. The flurry of letters that have come out of government departments, the kinds of statements that have come out in reaction and in response, I think triggered primarily by the churches, but they've been coming out of different stakeholders across this country, in itself tells you that it's a government that's not willing to see the world as you see it. So I think that answers your question.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you for that brief insight. Yes, thank you. Could I have Pearl Matibe? Pearl. Is Pearl there? Yeah. Unmute Pearl, please. Pearl, if she's not ready, I'll take Norman Nyazema. Norman. Urugupi Moyo. It's gone. Okay, let me get back to the panelists. Roger, I think you heard a lot. and especially around the military factor, whether you will still believe that the military is an intractable factor in the Zimbabwe process, or you are prepared to view it differently now. Roger?
I think what I'm hearing is comforting in the sense that, certainly it's quite clear that the military is not homogenous. I think what I'm hearing is the need to concentrate, and when we're thinking about getting the military out of politics, is the inducements which are being offered to withdraw. And I think the only thing I've heard so far, which has been particularly important, but nonetheless may not be sufficient in itself, is the idea of amnesty and the suggestion of a TRC. Now, if we go to the South African experience, we all know that the problem with the TRC here was it was backed up with threats to prosecute if you didn't come forward and basically confess your sins. And if you didn't, and then you could be subject to prosecution. The problem is we know that model didn't actually work terribly well. For a start, the number of the serious people who came forward to ask for amnesty is pretty dismal, and we know that it's one or two fish down the hierarchy who got caught up, who came to give amnesty, and on the whole the top brass got away with literally murder. And unfortunately, the one or two prosecutions which have taken place have not been terribly successful. So the idea is excellent, but trying to actually implement it is remarkably difficult. I don't know the way around it, but I think that it needs to be given a lot of consideration. And while the South African model may be an important one to emulate, I think one also needs to look carefully at the holes that were in the process. And that does imply a willingness to prosecute if people don't go forth. So I think this whole thing of thinking about what inducements you can offer to the military to withdraw is something which we need to give a lot of thought to. And that goes back, I mean, you don't want to just give inducements to the guys at the top, but you need to provide for the people in the lower parts of the hierarchy. I see a note at the bottom just come through, the amnesty and a pension. Yes, I think that's important. You need to, as I suggested earlier, you need to make sure that people are provided for so that they don't run around doing other sort of things. But maybe there are other sorts of inducements you need to think about too.
Newton Kanema, can you come in before I go to Musa? Newton?
Yeah. Hear me
Okay.
now?
Welcome, Newton.
Yes.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I guess this entire conversation, which is quite interesting, has established one thing, that the military is a big player to whatever is happening in Zimbabwe. And it's undeniable that ZANU-PF has got 2/3 majority in parliament. In the event that there is anything that could be acceptable to ZANU-PF, you would need their 2/3 to amend the constitution. And if you have got this line to say the military have to go back to the barrack, they are so powerful, and most arms of government have been militarized. There is no incentive for both the military and ZANU-PF to do this. with these conversations that have been going on, what attempts have you made to engage those two powerful forces whereby these conversations could begin to influence their thinking or show them a window for a solution? In the absence of them, the truth of the matter is we are phoning ourselves and speaking to ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, it's obvious that Newton has not been home for a long time. So what he sees is what he sees on paper. As someone said earlier on, things are much more fluid than this. I will ask Zamchiya to deal with the question later. But for now, there's been a question about amnesty also in relation to those with ill-gotten gains. We were talking about the alleged monies outside the country, which run into billions. So would Musa try to answer that?
I'll try to answer that, Ibbo. I'll also try to attempt to answer a question that Oswald raised. When it comes to amnesty, internationally, amnesties have been used as a carrot to try and bring people to the negotiating table and to drive towards a desired outcome. And I think in the case of Zimbabwe, it won't be any different. We have people who are in government, people who are in the military, with massive human rights violations that they've perpetrated, with massive cases of corruption and looting under their belts. And for those people to come to the table and to see the value of an NTA, you must speak to the personnel. They must know what is in it for them, how this is going to extricate them from the hole that they have dug for themselves. So it's an exercise of lobby and advocacy that involves speaking to the personnel, in addition to speaking to the broader contextual collapse, crisis issues, I think, that are there for everyone to see. Other than that, it's really going to be difficult to convince those in ZANU-PF and those in the military to see the need for this, because a lot of them, or at least some of them, they feel they see some sort of security in them holding on, which is really a false sense of security. The big question around amnesties is always when to introduce amnesties. Do we speak about amnesties now as we are mooting the idea of an NTA? Or we introduce the question of amnesties at an advanced stage? Or we introduce when we are at the negotiating table? That's always the biggest question when it comes to amnesties. When do you introduce them? And I don't have a clear answer for that. I think it's context specific. It depends on what we have achieved, how much ground we have covered, and only then can we determine whether we can introduce the issue of amnesties. But I want to speak, before I hand back to you, Ibbo, I want to speak to a question that Oswald raised regarding how politics permeates and bulldozes essentially everything in Zimbabwe. And his question was, how is the NTA that is being proposed going to deal with that? And I think for me, the answer lies in what you do during the transitional phase, where you have the NTA in place. What it means is, as the idea is being mooted and pushed, people need to be clear on what the game plan is, what's going to happen during those 2 or 3 years when we have this national transitional authority. Otherwise, it's just buying time, and after that we go to an election, and we know what elections bring in Zimbabwe, and life goes on. So there must be a clear game plan on the kind of reforms that we want to achieve during that transition period, and the kind of mandate that we are giving this NTA to achieve during that period. Otherwise, there might not be a good end to it. Thanks.
Zamchiya, can you deal with Chris Marolang's question, Jan Ngube's question, but more crucially, that raised by Newton Kanema just now about the nature and content of the power block that might be ZANU-PF and the military combined?
Thank you. Thank you, Ibbo. I think all those are very, very important questions. Maruleni's question, I think, let me try to start with that one. I think that there is a relationship between most of the ZIPRA commanders and those from the ANC Zimkondo Westfiza. So that relation has been there during the liberation movement, and there are still social and political connections that can be leveraged on. So it is still very possible to get the revolutionaries from the ANC talking to the revolutionaries in ZIPRA. But we should also try to be honest with history. There's this kind of revisionist history, revisionist narrative, kind of patriotic history being sold by ZANU, that they were at the forefront of the liberation of the region and of the African continent. And I think that is not entirely correct. Because if you look at some of the ZANLA commanders, we now have information that they were actually working with the apartheid government in South Africa in order to suppress ZAPU, in order to decimate ZAPU. If you go to the ANC comrades, it will be very difficult to get people even with direct links to a general, former general like Constantine Chiwenga. But if you go to the Frelimo guys in Mozambique, it might be easier to get links to people, with links to the ZANLA commanders. So this is not going to be just a South African issue. It also needs regional buy-in. And my point is that even if you don't get SADC as an entity, you can still get a regional reference group backed by the international community that can be able to support this initiative. And that regional reference group can be made up by those people who have links to the ZIPRA element, to the ZANLA element, and also to the civilian element, more importantly, actually. So, yeah, it's very possible to deal with that. Then people are talking about the need to have a negotiated settlement or not. I think you definitely need to have a negotiated settlement if you look at the realities at the moment. There's no way that you're not going to have incentives, disincentives, small and big actions, short-term and long-term plans. You need all those in the mix, because this is not like a revolution where one party has just won and that there's a rupture, immediate power vacuum. There's certainly going to be need for negotiations in order to avoid more bloodshed. There's no need, to come up with a solution after there's more bloodshed. There's absolutely no need. I wouldn't buy to that. So definitely you need to negotiate, because you have a political military. You have I think more aptly, you have a patrimonial political military. So you need to have a negotiated transition, at least at this juncture of the people's struggle. I really think that you cannot say that ZANU-PF, just by the virtue of the statement that they have been issuing publicly and the brave faces that they have been putting publicly, that they don't recognize that there's a crisis. I think we're being disingenuous ZANU-PF within the Politburo, they accept that there is a crisis. I've made reference to the pass-through Politburo meetings of ZANU-PF. It is very clear that what they have been discussing is an internal crisis that has become a public crisis. And if we have all listened to their acting spokesperson, Patrick Chinamasa, he has made it very clear that there's an internal coup that is brewing within ZANU-PF. It's a political coup that is brewing within ZANU-PF. And already some people have been suspended and subsequently fired from ZANU-PF for that. Imagine a Politburo member with posters written that ED must go. You see? So they might not agree, and they might give this dogma of papal infallibility to the public. But internally, they are debating this, and they are telling us that everything is not okay, and they are looking for solutions that how do you rescue us from this mess also. But central to that is an issue of how do you protect their interests as well, without being seen as if you are perpetuating the idea of impunity, which is not going to sell very well to some of the radicals within the civilian democratizing elites. So I want to say also, lastly, to my brother Newton, that the 2/3 that ZANU-PF has in parliament, it's a quantitative number, it's a reality, but qualitatively, in terms of moving Zimbabwe forward, it has meant nothing. That's why we are where we are. It has meant nothing. Actually, if it could have meant anything, it could have shown us that an incumbent transitional authority is possible, because that's one vehicle of doing it. Because they have
thank
to.
You very much. No, thank you. On that note, I think I'll come back to you for your last words along those lines. But in the meantime, I'm asking Roger and then our constitutional lawyer to include, as a sum up, the following questions which have arisen. One of the questions has to do with the issue of amnesty. On my part, I just want to add that at Lancaster, where I was a backroom boy, the amnesty arrangements were part of the settlement. It appeared to me then that the military factor, Zanla, Zipra, and the Rhodesian forces, with the help of the British, were quietly negotiating the amnesty arrangements. So the amnesty is usually part of the settlement. The second question, which is raised by Tsitsi Dangarembwa, is it a question of a blanket amnesty, which covers both the issue of the political and or political military aspects relating to atrocities, abuse, and so on and so forth, and the amnesty relating to loot lying outside the country. If someone has 5 billion outside the country, we want it back. What kind of amnesty arrangement could be negotiated in that respect? And there are precedents in Africa. Just last week, Abacha's loot was being returned from somewhere like Ireland, many years after his passing. But the one question that I have here is from South Africa. It says, take a leaf from ECOWAS to deal with coups. In West Africa, many instances of getting the military out of politics has taken place. And she adds, person who mediated Sudan may be available for Zimbabwe if you guys are interested. So there was someone, a mediator, and she advises, your mediator should not be from SADC region. You have to get sufficient mobilization to exert pressure for NTA from beyond the region. There's a question. So, Roger, your last thoughts and reference some of these questions. Roger.
I don't think I've got a lot to add, actually. Obviously, it's going to take it's going to be a long process. It's going to be an uneven process. And I think it's very difficult to address that, because it is going to drag on, and it's going to be unpredictable, I think. I think my last sort of comment, I mean, Ibbo, you're raising it too, this whole thing, how do you get the money back into the country? I mean, we're dealing with that in South Africa with just the whole, the whole state capture business. And, if the demilitarization is what you might call broadly a national process, getting your money back is an international one. And there's a lot of players out there who will talk nicely, but they don't particularly want to collaborate. So that's going to be a very important part of how you actually structure an amnesty arrangement. And I think you'd need the experts on that one. It's more than I can comment upon, because you've got to go through the international banking system and so on. So it's going to be a long and hard road. That's all I'm going to say.
Very much, Roger. Jestina, are you still around? Or you have bailed out? Jestina? She's gone. So I'll get back to Musa. Your last thoughts and some of those questions were raised, including those of amnesty. Musa?
Thanks, Ibbo. I will speak to the issue of amnesty again, since it keeps coming up. I think many would want to see prosecutions because of the history that we have endured as a country. Many would want to see prosecutions, but it's not just about prosecutions. Justice, healing, and moving forward is a combination of a lot of forms of justice. We need the money back. So those we can negotiate to bring the money back in exchange of not being prosecuted, if that is a possibility, that should be accepted in some cases. We can, exchange non-prosecution with truth-telling. Truth-telling is an extremely important aspect of moving forward as a nation. And that is a part of it. Of course, prosecutions also is a part of it, sometimes with reduced sentences, sometimes with reduced number of counts, etc. So it's a combination. They can't be one size fits all approach when we are chasing nation building. The punitive approach to accountability may not always work in this kind of delicate situations where a negotiated future of some sort is being attempted. I think I'll end it there, Ibbo.
Thanks, Musa. Yousra Zamchiya, your last words.
Thank you, Ibbo. I think my concluding remarks, I'll start from where I ended, that what we have witnessed since the military coup in 2017 is that you cannot have an incumbent-driven transitional authority. And also what we have learned from the GNU 2009 to 2013 is that you cannot have a kind of a power sharing driven transitional authority. It totally failed. And given what is happening in Zimbabwe at the moment, that citizens are suffering, and the most populist mantra is that we need a revolution to supplant. But it seems that the state is thwarting that revolution at the moment, and we're not going to be able to have a revolutionary-led transitional authority. So we have two options there: an indigenous transitional authority in the form of the NTA, which can be improved through making it mass-based action, or an international-driven transitional authority with the international community having power. And I think that one is going to be difficult because you're going to need to go through the United Nations Security Council. You have Russia, you have China, it's going to be complex. But also being myself patriotic, I believe that Zimbabweans have what it takes to drive their own indigenous provisional authority that can try to resolve the current political and economic crisis and fulfill the ideals and values of the liberational movement, which were also about economic emancipation of the indigenous population, but freedom of assembly, association, expression, human rights for the greater people of Zimbabwe or who live in it. Thank you.
Thank the panelists and the discussants shortly, but just to conclude this very interesting session, we began with the three critical questions. The first was, are we on the eve of an all-inclusive national dialogue that reflects the nature of the crisis and the need to resolve it? I think we are. I think we are, definitely. The plethora of meetings around the crisis, the common thread, the common theme about the need for a political settlement, an NTA, the comprehensive national settlement, all this rings through the various statements in the last few days. The second is who will play the mediation role. Yousra Zamchiya thinks it's a clear option between an indigenous-led process towards an NTA or an international one, which he sees as a bit complex. But I think that the history of Zimbabwe and the settlements associated with this history ever since Lancaster, and if you want to go back to 1961 constitutional talks in London, has always involved national, regional, and international, which precludes even the UN. The level at which international and regional mediation can cause a national consensus towards a settlement. And I thought that in our situation, we should look closely at that, including the important role that South Africa appears to be playing right now. And the question, of course, we want to raise in the context of this discussion, would the South Africans put on the agenda, or the region, SADC and AU, put the NTA on the agenda? And unfortunately, Yousra had left us. Wanted to ask, in the case of Sudan, whether the AU was involved. And would like to ask the questioner who will raise that question, that the mediator in the Sudanese situation is available, and that person appears to have been outside Sudan, possibly AU, possibly ECOWAS. The third question was, can this happen? Is the NTA possible? I think both Zamchiya and Musa Kika were very, very affirmative about that. That it can happen, that it should happen, and that it is the only way forward. It leaves us now to consider, as we go forward, how this can be put into place, and whether what's going on in the region, in the talks about talks, the talks about envoys, can be returned to Zimbabwe, the extent to which this issue has become so live in the region at the AU level, can we expect in the coming weeks and months that some kind of solution, or the beginnings of a solution along the lines of an NTA is possible? I'll leave it at that, but also to thank Jestina, Roger, Yousra, Musa, and Zamchiya for being so combative in the manner in which they approach this subject. I want to say on my own behalf, and I'm sure my colleague Tony Riro will agree, it went far beyond what we expected. We're with a lot of criticism for even fielding the question or the theme of NTA as presumptuous or even preemptive of possible solutions. But I believe we have gone a step higher and opened new possibilities around the possibilities of resolution of the crisis in Zimbabwe. So I'd like to thank you, all of you. And there were we had many questions. It was not possible to go beyond this. We will be back in a fortnight. And write in, tell us what you think we should discuss next on the back of this discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you to the back room, Robert, and everybody else. Thank you. Thank you.